Well, guess it's about time I finally get around to this one. My first year doing MMO Grinder, I knew I wanted to do a Halloween episode, and even though I didn't have too many choices in mind, I was informed that Hellgate London was back in some capacity. Then, torn between two titles, I had them up in a poll, and Hellgate won by a landslide. Thinking I'd push the title to the next year, my mind was changed when I suddenly decided to give more press to the Secret World, despite it not being a free-to-play game, because, hell, I already made an exception for Guild Wars 2, and it's not like that game needed any more freaking press. So let's start round 3 and get to this passed-over, ever-more aged title. This is the MMO Grinder, and it's time to look at Requiem. Published and developed by Gravity Interactive, the same company behind the Ragnarok series, and released in North America in 2008, initially as Requiem Bloody Mare, and later changed to Requiem Memento Mori in the US and Requiem Alive in Korea. I'm just going to call it Requiem because subtitles are stupid. Requiem mixes the setting of what might be expected from a fantasy MMO, but adds in horror elements, as the world Requiem takes place in was besieged by an apocalypse and the land is now overrun with demons and horrific mutated creatures, causing a nigh unpronounceable secret society to create clones of the races of the Terran, Cruxena, Bartuk, and Zenoa to fight back against the hordes. So, you know, bad shit happened, go kill monsters. So let's see if this long-neglected game was worth the unintentional 2-year wait. There's a beyond obvious aesthetic to this game, seen immediately from the opening title screen and permeating throughout the title. It's a very dark, gory, and gritty game. The world itself is desolate, vastly ruined, occasionally empty, and generally unpleasant to look at. Partially due to the fact that the environment textures and effects are absurdly low-res. Somewhat similar to how EverQuest 2 worked, this game decided to go for high-detailed and well-animated character and enemy models, and completely skim focus on the world itself. There's a massive fog effect around the world that varies on the area you're in, and I have this game's draw distance set to max. In fact, all of the settings are cranked to their highest levels, and this is the best it can look. While the open world leaves much to be desired, there are specific places that do much better in their detail, such as many of the cities, and the first dungeon I was finally being able to locate, well, world dungeon at least, had a very H.R. Geiger-inspired design, and for the most part it was fairly creepy compared to the rest of the world, which I can charitably describe as bland and accurately describe as kind of boring. This is made up quite a bit in the character and enemy models, with character models having very high-res textures, slick lighting effects and animations, and the enemies being seriously disturbing looking, with major note going to the tried-and-true MMO enemies of the spider being a strange mutated face with twitching eyes. It's just sad that some of that creativity and attention couldn't be more placed into the world itself. On both enemy and player models, your character takes visible physical damage when reaching a certain health percentage, even if the applied texture doesn't look all that great up close. Enemies mostly tend to physically react to their hits, and each attack will feel very impactful due to this. The final kicker is this game's use of the Havoc physics engine, as defeating enemies doesn't just mean that they'll fall over in a regular prescripted death animation and then fade away. When an enemy is killed in this game, you might knock off their head, remove one of their limbs, send them dismembered into pieces in an explosion of blood, or most amusingly, knocking them clear off into the sky and seeing their body parts rain down as a result. As amazing and as fun as this can be, it does take away from the horror aspect a bit, and there's an odd bug that occurs occasionally where your enemy's various body parts are still connected by a polygon that'll stretch amusingly between each part as it flies through the air. The interface is also very tiny and minimalist, obviously designed for when the popular resolution was 4x3, and it's just kind of forced off into the corners of the screen like it's embarrassed to be near you. It's pretty easy to adjust, but there is an odd tendency for some of the windows to reset their position each time you log back in. I really don't like where the game places your health bar by default, since buffs will appear directly underneath that health bar, and more than 2 buffs will cover your bottom hotbar unless you move it. And that's one of the windows that keeps wanting to reset itself. A bit of frustration there. This is kind of a tough category to report on, for a good reason. One, you'll notice that right away from the opening title screen, the music in this game is pretty amazing. In fact, the samples you've been hearing in this review are probably a good indication of this. There's a lot of choir-backed tracks that give a feeling of dark fantasy, and some amazing guitar and metal tracks to be had. You might be thinking, this seems like a pretty legit, spooky, and highly interesting soundtrack. What's to complain about? It doesn't play. Like, almost ever. You'll hear next to nothing when you're out in the field. Instead, the desolation of the world will be mirrored by nothing more than a faint wind howling and the occasional "I think that was music" sting that'll play when entering new areas. Finding this game's soundtrack is oddly difficult, and I was convinced that this game, for a while, didn't have much of a soundtrack because it rarely to never comes about in any notable form. In fact, you pretty much have to go searching for it, as it's contained mostly to PvP battlegrounds and again certain dungeons and landmarks. When I uncovered some more of the tracks when I was searching online, I had to convince myself that it was this game's soundtrack, and not just someone's personal playlist disguised as an official soundtrack to Requiem. This game could seriously do well with a battle theme or something, but the closest you get to that is the guitar riff that'll play when you go into your demon form, and that lasts for maybe a minute at the most. The very little music you do hear is almost immediately drowned out by the sound, and while it is very impactful, especially during combat, it's really an attention grabber and fits better to an action game than anything horror-related. Hey, isn't that the exact same issue people had with the sound work for The Secret World? Characters also do that Korean grinder tradition of yelling out each of their attacks in a language that might not actually be a language. I'm fairly certain a few of the words spoken by the Turan race are in Latin, as Lux is very obviously shouted when casting shields. But the Templar attack skills sound like your character is yelling "Doom!" or an odd combination of fire and "Hiya!" with every attack. It's unignorable. Enemy sounds are standard growls and such, and they can seriously stand to be much more unsettling to match more how they look, which is unfortunately not often the case. Even the death gurgles are pretty expected and standard of many creatures that you would hear in MMOs, and I'd swear this croc is doing a faint Wilhelm scream when it dies. Sound is a really mixed bag is all. This game is available on Warp Portal, Steam, or even a browser client that's available through Facebook or their website. There, that should keep people from needlessly mentioning that in the comments. Starting out, you'll notice your choice of this game's only server as you log in. It's tagged as PK available and age 17, but it's not like you have any choice in the matter. Off the bat, I will tell you that PK seemed more like an opt-in program, so gankers aren't going to be a threat unless you specifically want them to be. The 17 probably refers to the game's tone. There doesn't seem to be any chat filter on by default if one exists at all in this game, and there is a chance to see nudity in this game depending on the items you or other players possess. Character creation is highly limited, allowing you only a choice of gender and a small choice of faces and hairstyles, not even allowing you to choose your hair color, so the likelihood you'll run across someone that looks exactly like you is pretty high. On the plus side, this game allows you to create 8 characters with no set limit, which is coincidentally the exact number of available starter classes within the game. Your class choices are limited by race and eventually will boil down to the physical or magical versions of that race's class. The Turan are your basic default human-style race, and can be the sword and boardish defenders, or the magic-focused melee damage and heal-focused Templars. Bartok are hulking, muscle-bound people bearing high resemblance to a fantasy orc, with both classes proficient in melee, the warrior being your high-damage bruiser, and the shaman augmenting their attacks with fire magic. Kruxena bear the high similarity to dark elves, with a bit more focus on a demonic look, with claw-like hands, cat eyes, and a shiny, scaly skin that the female and male models are quite fond of showing off. They can play as melee-focused rogues or debuff magic-focused soul hunters. Lastly, the Zenoa are a diminutive, intelligence-focused race bearing high resemblance to aliens, especially with their elongated skulls. Zenoa stick mostly to range, with their physical class being gun-wielding rangers, and the magic class being the much more on-the-nose battle magicians, who can play support with buffs and healing. Each class receives a job change much later on in the game, allowing them to specialize in a playstyle within that class. Originally, each class started out as a classless Temperion that got to choose their job at level 10, but a rework of the game cut out the middleman and lets you choose from the start now. Before you can play, the game will ask you to input and set in a passcode for your character. Once set, the game will let you in and you'll have to re-enter it every single time you want to head to the character selection screen. Keep in mind that you must do this for every new character you create, and it's tied to your characters, not your account. Entering the game offers to let you into the tutorial, which you can refuse immediately or even skip while you're in the middle of it, sometimes by accident, as the skip button is right next to the OK button on a lot of the tutorial tips. And the game isn't very clear on what you're supposed to be doing sometimes. It's pretty easily ignored and won't really affect you in any way that you won't be able to figure out on your own, provided you've played this type of MMO before. Controls remain in the standard 3D fantasy MMO style of WASD, save for the odd fact that A and D turn instead of strafe, while Q and E will do the opposite. I switched the control to have A and D strafe, but it's strictly to your taste, even if it is the opposite of most of these games. While you can target an attack by mouse-clicking and double-clicking, pressing F by default will initiate auto-attack. You can also use any attack skills you have slotted by pressing the corresponding hotkey on your keyboard or on screen, but there's an odd quirk where your attacks will not work, despite you currently targeting and auto-attacking an enemy. If the enemy's health bar is not displayed on the top of the screen, then the attack just won't work and you might need to target them again. It's a really weird issue. When loot drops, you'll see a small glowing box, which can be tricky to click on, but pressing G will open any loot nearby that you can personally obtain. It takes a bit of the headache out of precision clicking. And on a final control quirk, if you happen to notice that you're suddenly in walk mode instead of run mode, pressing the V key will toggle between those two, so you don't have to search through your options in a panic. The game doesn't do too well on telling you how things work, as there are translation issues abound and generally vague and unhelpful information. Even in the Help menu, many tooltips will tell you to equip the many Xeon shards that you'll find at a property blacksmith. There's no such thing. You'll need to find an enchanting blacksmith to equip them, and I'll go into that process later. There's also a quest that requires items from quest scrolls that are apparently sold by an NPC named Risi. Here's the name of the NPC that sells those items. Speaking of terribly explained mechanics, it's time for one of the game's neater features, the Possession Beast, or simply put, a demon transformation rage move. In order to use this, as your Help menu does sweet FA telling you how this works, press L and then move the Possession Beast that you will obtain from your very first non-tutorial quest into the slot in that window. After it's been slotted, drag that icon down onto your action bar. I haven't been able to find any other way to transform, and the game itself doesn't tell you how to do this, leaving my starting experience highly frustrating. Once your hardcore meter is full, which will be identified by a small number above your life bar, which will display a percentage sign like HC:75% 0 in parentheses. Once the number in the parentheses reads 1 and the symbol next to your life bar is glowing, click on the slotted icon of the demon to transform. The percentage will start counting down and usually lasts only a minute. You can perform your regular attacks in beast form, but they will do far more damage. After the timer ends, you'll transform back and your HC meter will slowly fill again over time. Enemies killed in beast form will earn your demon experience and levels to power them up as well. Your demon depends on your race, and they come in a plethora of horrifying demon names like Rufus and Carlos. Creating a new account grants you a few free starter items that are normally seen in the cash shop, the most useful being the 7-day mount, and the transport controller that will instantly teleport you to any of the starting area's quest hubs with no cooldown, but a limited number of charges. Some items you get, like the experience booster, aren't used like most games traditionally have them. Instead, they must remain in your bag in order for them to take effect. You can also get a nice cash shop bonus item by hitting the 1-a-day item spinner found in the mess of tiny buttons on the right side of the screen. Backspace might seem limited, and while plenty of items drop, many of them are stackable, and a lot of the equipment you find is exactly the same, meaning you won't be tempted to hold on to multiple pieces to hold out for better stats. A good rule of thumb to start is to equip the item set that boosts physical if you're a physical class, and magical if you're magic focused. The sets will usually have a name that you'll come to recognize after the first dozen or so drop. Despite the plethora of loot and enhancement crystals that drop, one reason I never seem to run out of bag space is that many of the starting quests grant you an extra bag slot, ending in 4 total bags of 25 slots each. Again, fairly generous. Leveling up, which at first happens ridiculously fast and with little fanfare, grants you skill points to slot into your various skills by pressing K. You'll take immediate notice that the game doesn't have all that many skills to begin with, for any of the classes, and you'll have more points than you'll need to grab and max most of the available skills right away, at least until level 30 or so. You'll also get 25 DNA points right from the get-go, accessible by pressing N. It might be best to wait for a while before you start slotting those points to better augment what your playstyle will be. This is a very basic questing system. Click on NPCs with exclamation points, take their quests, and that's it. In the first area you'll come across very few this way. Instead, if you want to gain more rewards, you'll need to purchase quest scrolls from the agent NPCs for a fairly inconsequential amount of the in-game cash called Lant. You can't use scrolls that have higher level quests than you are, but you can purchase them and keep them until you reach that level. At first you can easily skip over these, as you level up insanely fast in the starting area of Turba, and the enemies, even those 10 levels above you, will give you almost no trouble to defeat unless they're elites. Even elites can be easily defeated if you're fairly close in their level and have half a brain. Later levels, when the leveling hits a wall, the scroll quests are the best way to supplement some of that much needed XP. To track your quest, simply double-click on the quest name in the quest tracker, and then click on the search map location in the map that will show you the general location of the enemies, the NPC that granted you the quest, and the NPC that you'll need to turn it into. You may have to read the quest log so you don't waste time or a teleport going to the wrong area once you've finished a quest. Will require you to fight a nightmare monster, which will only appear during the in-game hours of 2300 to 0200, or 11 PM to 2 AM. While the quest for these will normally read, "This monster will only appear at night," the night they speak of only lasts for this amount of time. You'll know when it's night, as the game will play a sound, the screen will darken, and then flash black for a second before coming back to normal. The same effect also happens once night is over. Nightmare monsters are usually elite monster strength, sometimes stronger and sometimes weaker, but always annotated with an eyeball icon next to their health bar. For reference, elite enemies are represented by a skull icon, and normal enemies don't have an icon. The problem I have with these nightmare quests is that the window to do them is absurdly short compared to the rest of the day. 1 minute in Requiem is 5 seconds, meaning that the 3-hour night only lasts 15 minutes. And if you miss this short window to perform this quest, you won't be able to do it again for 1 hour and 45 minutes. It's especially annoying when you reach the level to do the quest scroll and then find out that night has just passed. At this point, I just skip the nightmare quests if I can. Beside the limited item you get at the start, there's other forms of fast travel in this game, including the standard flight points in the form of wing riders, which can only fly to an area that they're connected to, so if you have to fly clear across the map, you might have to do a few layovers. These are also used for an inconsequential fee of land. There are usually return point NPCs standing near the wing riders as well, and these will let you instantly recall to that point with a return skill which has a fairly long cooldown. Finally, if your mount wears off after 7 days, an early quest will grant you another one. That moves at a 20% increase of your current running speed. Wow, don't hurt yourselves with that generosity, guys. The death penalty in the game isn't all that bad. You do lose a percentage of XP, which might be rough when you start seeing the XP amount you get come to a crawl, but it's easily earned back without much notice. Once killed, you can either wait for someone to res you, use a special item to res yourself on the spot, or recall to your home point or the nearest spawn point. You'll then have to repair your gear for what, once again, isn't all that much land in the grand scheme of things. It took me so long to get to the death penalty in this game because it is really tough to die starting out. I don't just mean the tutorial areas, I mean like well into your level 20s. In the beginning areas, and hell, a good amount of the game, you have to purposefully try to die. Here I am as a level 3, surrounded by 5 enemies ranging from level 12 to 14, and I'm still lasting far longer than I should despite not fighting back. I got up to get a drink and came back 40 seconds later to finally see myself get killed. To be honest, regular questing in this game is absurdly easy, like auto-attack your way to victory kind of easy. Skills might have sped the process up, but rarely to never when facing regular enemies. Even those vastly out-leveling me, did I ever have an issue taking them down. Even the elites are easily dispatched if you're fighting them one-on-one and know when to heal yourself. Use the Possession Beast and you'll even tear through elites like cardboard. The unfortunate of the matter is that the game is no longer scary or threatening in any way, shape, or form. There's nothing you can't handle, and it's more hilarious than anything. Items can be, well, not easily upgraded, but a little bit simplistic. You can either raise the level of an item by finding a reinforcement NPC, which requires you to unequip the item, slot it in the first slot, and then use 10 basic Zeons and some Lant to rise it by 1. Something I find odd no matter how often I did this, was that there was never less than a 100% success rate in completing this. And if you have enough basic Zeons, you can keep leveling the piece for no penalty, making your gear absurdly powerful. I assume this might change at higher levels, but it didn't for any time I was playing it. You can also enchant your gear with stat augments by finding the Enchanting Blacksmith, and this time adding an enchantment Zeon, usually a red item in your inventory, which if you're actively looting anything you'll end up having a ton of, and another stack of 10 basic Zeons. Otherwise, same process applies. You can only add the number of enhancements to your gear that it'll allow you to, usually 3. It's possible, once you know how the game works, to completely sail through the opening 20 to 25 levels in a matter of an hour or two, and when ready to reach the new area, head to the warp location in Zakat Town and talk to the NPC there to head to the new town Nova Lux in the Parnas region. One thing you'll notice immediately in Parnas is that the questing seems way more standard, but the area is far larger and will take much longer to get around, and the rate of how you gain levels will slow dramatically. The area is also massive, and you'll be spending a good amount of time in one area of the map before moving on to the next, especially if you're clearing out both the scroll and normal quests. While you might be able to hit level 25 in an hour or two, you won't hit level 30 for nearly 3 times as long. It's absurdly jarring. As I mentioned before, there are job changes in this game, and with the class I played most often, the Templar, you could go either more spell damage focused with the Tempest, or play more of a healer role with the Radiant. Since you can't get your job change until level 50, and I only managed to get up to level 33, yeah, that wasn't happening. Overall, the gameplay experience is a bit of a toss-up, and despite the aesthetic and very visceral combat, the base of the game is completely no frills. It's pretty much a grinder without too much of a focus on just straight-up monster grinding, but the quest totals required to complete them will certainly feel like it. You know that desolation I spoke about? It's not just an aesthetic. This game isn't exactly crawling with players. It's not to say it's dead. The wide open spaces, it just ends up feeling rather empty. I will say you're pretty likely to run across a more tightly populated area if you enter a PvP battleground available at level 20. These games can range from team deathmatch style to a massive zone capturing mode. In a tooltip, the game will tell you something along the lines of, you can enter the game at any level, it doesn't matter if you're low, implying that the battlefields are level matched. The game is full of shit. My first foray into the matches was an actual utter massacre if I tried to do so much as head into the actual battle, with other players destroying me in a few hits. It's really not worth heading into these matches unless you're a much higher level, and more likely after you've gotten your second class upgrade. On the plus side, for getting beaten mercilessly, you do get a ton of experience points for participating. I was shocked not to see as much as a single dungeon appear throughout the entire first area of the game, and I was wondering if I was just missing something. However, I did notice an NPC who granted me a premium dungeon key for the next city, which allowed me to tour the dungeon in that city, a feature apparently locked to non-paying members. This baffled me further, making me wonder if I was going to see any dungeons in this game. And when I was finally able to enter and locate that dungeon in the city, the key I was granted vanished from my inventory. It only lasted 10 minutes. However, that only applies to those premium content dungeons, and I did notice that the quest granted you a key that would reset each day. I was luckily able to find a regular instance dungeon later on in the next area, in a place called Ruins of Lament, and it was fairly impressive with a skeletal H.R. Geiger motif, twisting paths, sectioned off areas, and it was just too bad the person I was running it with had no idea how it worked. That's the thing about this community. I don't want to speculate, but there are a lot of issues abound that I can't quite prove, but have a ton of reasons to believe. At face value, this is a decent community, it's not too intrusive, and there isn't really any kill stealing seemingly going on. And usually there's enough cooperation between players out in the field. It's just, there's two more obvious type of players in this game. Immature and non-native English speakers. They practically run this. More often than not, everyone you'll run into will either speak in tech-speak, broken English, or non-English, or a combination of the three. One PvP match I had was met with a player barking random orders at me in random languages, like they were hoping I'd understand one of them, and English was their last choice. That order turned out to be a very useless go back to base, as the base wasn't exactly protected. The enemy team seemed to know that those people would send me back there, and more often than not would send someone or everyone to head after me, since they knew my allies weren't exactly sticking together or protecting anyone, but I digress. I spent entirely too much time in the field being harassed by other players anytime I was playing as a female avatar. No, I don't want to tell you where I'm from, I don't want to know where you're from, and I don't want to chat with you. I don't need to join you in a group, and in the event I do join your group, you are not going to spend the rest of the play session following me around once the quest is over. This also happened to a friend of mine who was playing alongside me until they got so fed up they just uninstalled the game, so it's not exactly a freak occurrence. Hey, guys, you know that sexy girl avatar that you see running around on your screen isn't an exact reflection of the person controlling it, right? You're hitting on code! Knock that shit off! Seriously, you'll be spammed with duel requests or guild invites regardless if you've declined them, and it happens so often that the game has an option to automatically and immediately refuse them. It makes me wonder how often some of these people will just still be clicking on you, trying to gauge a response like you just didn't get their message proper the first few dozen times. I really don't get why so many of these mature games attract such an immature, socially childish audience. At least the chats are quiet. As guilds go, it uses the charter system, where in order to form a guild you need a certain amount of signatures, and in this case 9, to establish the guild. An odd aspect of the game, and one that might explain the duel invites from high-level players, even if I'm pretty sure it's still mostly due to power gamers lacking in skill and confidence to beat someone at their appropriate level, it's that the other players' levels are not displayed on screen unless you are in a party with them. The only exception to this is when someone asks you to duel, where the game will actually show you the level of the person challenging you. Not that they won't just keep spamming you if you refuse. Set your social options accordingly and prepare for some additional headaches. Using the Warp Portal points, which sell for 100 points on the dollar, this is a cash shop I find fairly intimidating, mostly because it's painfully minimalist and hideously ugly. There's a few small and over-abbreviated tabs on the top, barely explaining what the contents do, save for a few more common areas like costumes and mounts under the Transport tab, packages labeled for specific zones containing those teleporters I mentioned earlier, and items that will boost the chance for crafting, which I assume would actually be useful at later levels. I am rather baffled by the game's constant talking about premium subscriptions, which apparently run at $8 a month, because as much as the game tells you about them, it does not once tell you how to get them. I don't see any option for a premium count in the shop, and the tab labeled premium, as well as character for that matter, is completely blank. I was wondering if I could even subscribe to this game if I wanted to. Was it even an option anymore? Well, yes, but you really have to dig for it. If you go to your account page through Warp Portal and click on the power-up icon next to Requiem, and then click on the tab labeled Premium Services, you can choose the basic or premium account options in various time chunks. The game also makes use of server megaphones, which unlike some games, relegates the megaphone messages to a scrolling bar tucked away in the upper left corner. I once saw someone use a megaphone just to scroll pay to win across the server. The fact I'm killing most enemies with stock gear while using auto attacks makes me wonder what he thinks pay to win means. One major issue about the mounts and costumes in this game, they are all rentals, 30-day rentals. While at least fairly priced for the most part, even with flying mounts going for merely a couple dollars worth of points, it's still a pet peeve of mine as well as many other people. Of course, if you want to go the costume route, there's plenty of hard-to-see icons where you can see what there is to offer, including the birthday suit. Wonderful. Between that and the topless rideable female centaur mount, you gotta shoehorn in that 17+ rating somehow. Requiem isn't entirely what I was hoping for, but it did offer a few more things than I expected. Still, like Hellgate London before it, you can tell that this is a game that underwent some serious cuts and revisions, and it's not entirely easy to say that it was for the best. Is it a bloody, visceral fantasy-styled MMO with a horror setting? Sure. Is it scary? Hell no. The horror is kinda lost when you launch your enemy clear into the sky and their stretched polygons try desperately to play catch-up, when that threatening monster nearly 10 levels ahead of you gets its ass kicked in a few hits, or when you walk around the endless vast wasteland of brown with not more than a few odd landmarks to break up the monotony. Yeah, it's a mature-themed MMO, but with Age of Conan and the Secret World on the market, it's not like Requiem will be your only fix of boobs and blood in your questing. Here's my final rating. As these kinds of MMOs go, this is easily one of the darker, more disturbing, bloody, and visceral of the fantasy games. Sure, I mentioned Age of Conan, but the aesthetic of this game is far, far darker. It's like an MMO End of Days. Come to think of it, I think Gravity totally wasted the title Ragnarok in this case. The designs of the monsters and enemies is really pretty creative and well tended to, and you can tell a lot of effort and imagination was placed into making the monsters truly monsters, not just giant versions of existing creatures, or humans with a few extra limbs. This also isn't a bad game for a beginner's MMO, as the gameplay remains pretty simple throughout, and the easy fights and lack of skills won't really overwhelm anyone new to the genre. Since the cash shop is full of rentals, make sure you make your purchases accordingly, but the mount and teleporters will shave off most of your downtime in this game, and make the most worthwhile of the purchases. If you enjoy the game enough, there's always subscription options, provided you can find them. With the dodgy translation and tiny minimalist interface and text, this game doesn't do all that well to explain some of its more complex mechanics, even if many players would make do just fine without using too many of them. This is a game where you'll want to bring a wiki up for the minute you start delving into some of its more complex systems. The low-res environments are extremely jarring against the level and detail usually seen in the players and enemies, and the minute you start running across low-res textures and polygonal rocks or draw distance drowning fog effects for the 8th time, you'll spend more time just wanting to look at anything more pleasant. Even if you don't place too much stock in a game's graphics, you might find this just a bit too simple in places. As a very quest-focused and simplistic kill X things questing system, the game tends to be a bit repetitive, especially once you're sent out to the same area several times to kill off the same enemies. Finally, this game is easily a shadow of its former self. Even a short trip to a forum from a few years ago will reveal all that's now missing from this game for the sake of streamlining, and a lot of those scars are very visible. Some former players of Requiem, when it was still known as Bloody Mare, might be wondering why I didn't mention a certain skill or a certain system, and unless you played in the past year or so, it's possible that just might not be there anymore. If there isn't enough left to the game that you love to go back to, I'd completely understand. Well, that's enough for me for at least a little bit. Maybe I should check in on some of the games that I've looked at previously are doing. Some of them are seriously overdue for a revisit.
coming soon to the MMO Grinder, it's the backtrack block. What's the backtrack block? Let me finish talking and I'll tell you, you impatient bastard. After doing 3 World MMO episodes in a row, Chaos is feeling he might need a bit of a break. MMO Grinder will be taking a short hiatus from doing full episodes to look back at some of your favorite titles he's already covered, and check out how they're doing. Classics like Luna Online, Dungeon Fighter Online, Fantasy Tennis, City of Heroes, Project Powder, and many more. No, not all of them. What kind of fool do you take him for? Why would he look at EverQuest 2 again right now? I mean, he just did that. What could possibly have changed in the time? Stay tuned to MMOGrinder.net, Blip, YouTube, or wherever you happen to watch these horrid videos from November 1st to November 30th to check out the Backtrack block and see all new content based off of all old content. And remember, if you're watching this past that date, that means it's already happened. Don't be an idiot. The Backtrack block, because he's not getting enough time to play Dragon's Prophet.